The film set was alive with energy, a whirlwind of activity that buzzed like a beehive. Crew members darted back and forth, adjusting lights, checking cameras, and whispering instructions into their headsets. The air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paint, mingling with the nervous excitement that always seemed to linger on movie sets. This was supposed to be a big day for Sandra Bullock. She had been cast in what many considered her breakout role, a chance to prove herself as more than just another pretty face in Hollywood. Her heart raced as she stood under the bright studio lights, waiting for the director to call action. Sandra had spent weeks preparing for this moment. She had studied her character inside and out, memorizing every line and understanding every emotion her role demanded. She wanted to give her all to show everyone, especially herself, that she belonged here. But today something felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before, a heaviness in the air that made it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the pressure of delivering a perfect performance. It was the presence of the director. He was known throughout the industry for his explosive temper and relentless pursuit of perfection. His reputation preceded him, and Sandra had heard stories about how he could reduce even the most seasoned actors to tears with a single cutting remark. As the first scene of the day unfolded, Sandra did her best to focus. She delivered her lines with confidence, moving through the choreography of the scene with practiced ease. But no matter how well she performed, the director didn't seem satisfied. "Cut!" he barked abruptly, stopping the scene halfway through. Sandra froze, unsure of what she had done wrong. The director paced in front of the camera, his face twisted in frustration. "Let's take it again," he said sharply, not bothering to explain what needed improvement. Sandra nodded quickly, trying to push aside the knot forming in her stomach. She took a deep breath and prepared to go again. The second take went smoother, or at very least, Sandra thought so. She poured every ounce of emotion into her performance, letting the words flow naturally from her lips. But when she finished, the director shook his head dismissively. "No, no, no," he muttered, rubbing his temples as if her performance had physically pained him. "You're missing the point entirely." Sandra blinked, feeling a wave of embarrassment wash over her. She glanced around the set, catching glimpses of sympathetic faces among the crew. They were used to the director's harsh critiques, but that didn't make them any easier to bear. By the third attempt, Sandra's nerves were fraying. She tried to channel her anxiety into her acting, hoping it would translate into raw emotion on screen. But the director wasn't having it. "Again!" he shouted, louder this time. His voice echoed across the set, silencing everyone except the hum of the overhead lights. Sandra swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. She couldn't afford to let her emotions get the better of her. Not now. Not here. She repeated the scene once more, clinging to the hope that this time it would be enough. But the director's patience, or lack thereof, was wearing thin. After the fourth take, he stormed onto the set, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Every eye followed him as he approached Sandra, who stood frozen in place, gripping the script in her hands like a lifeline. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you wish for noise. The director stopped just inches away from her, his piercing gaze scanning her face as if searching for some hidden flaw. "What is wrong with you?" he finally asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "This isn't rocket science. You're supposed to feel it, not just say it." Sandra opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She felt like a deer caught in headlights, trapped and unable to move. Her cheeks burned with shame as the weight of his words sank in. Around her, the crew shifted uncomfortably, pretending to busy themselves with tasks they didn't need to do. No one dared to intervene, knowing full well the consequences of crossing the director. Even the other actors kept their distance, exchanging uneasy glances but saying nothing. It was clear that Sandra was on her own. The director continued his tirade, each word landing like a punch to the gut. "Do you even understand what we're trying to accomplish here? Or are you just going through the motions because someone told you you're talented?" His voice rose with every sentence, growing louder and angrier until it filled the entire soundstage. Sandra stared at the floor, willing herself not to cry. She hated showing weakness, especially in front of others. Tears wouldn't solve anything. They'd only give the director more ammunition to use against her. Still, she could feel the lump in her throat growing bigger, threatening to choke her. In the midst of the chaos, Keanu Reeves watched quietly from the sidelines. He had been observing the situation unfold, his brow furrowed in concern. Unlike the rest of the cast and crew, Keanu wasn't content to simply stand by and watch. He had always believed in treating others with kindness and respect, regardless of their position or status. To him, the film industry wasn't just about making movies. It was about building connections and supporting one another. And right now, Sandra needed support more than ever. As the director paused to catch his breath, Keanu stepped forward. His movement was subtle but deliberate, drawing attention without being confrontational. He positioned himself between Sandra and the director, creating a physical barrier that signaled his intent to intervene. The director frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "What is it?" he snapped, turning his ire toward Keanu. For a brief moment, Keanu hesitated. He knew the risks of challenging someone as powerful as the director, but he also knew he couldn't stay silent. Taking a deep breath, he spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "I think she's doing great," he said, meeting the director's glare with unwavering resolve. The director's eyes narrowed as he processed Keanu's words. For a moment, the entire set seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how the volatile man would react. His face was unreadable, a mix of surprise and irritation playing across his features. No one had ever dared to challenge him so directly, not on this set, not in front of everyone. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Sandra stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or terrified by Keanu's intervention. Keanu didn't flinch under the director's glare. Instead, he held his ground, his calm demeanor unshaken. "She's working hard," he continued, his voice steady and measured. "Maybe we're focusing too much on what's wrong instead of building on what's right." His words were simple but carried an undeniable weight. He wasn't accusing the director of being unfair. He was simply suggesting a different approach, one that prioritized collaboration over criticism. The crew exchanged cautious glances, unsure whether to admire Keanu's bravery or brace themselves for the fallout. For a long moment, the director said nothing. He stared at Keanu, his jaw clenched tightly, as if trying to decide whether to explode or back down. Finally, he let out a sharp sigh and turned away, muttering something under his breath. It wasn't an apology, nor was it an outright acceptance of Keanu's suggestion, but it was enough. The storm had passed, for now. "Fine," the director snapped, waving a hand dismissively. "Let's take 5. Everyone regroup when I call." With that, he stormed off the set, leaving behind a trail of palpable relief. As soon as he was out of earshot, the atmosphere began to shift. The tightness in the air loosened and people started moving again, resuming their tasks with renewed energy. Sandra exhaled deeply, her shoulders sagging as the weight of the confrontation lifted, at least temporarily. She looked at Keanu, her eyes wide with gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of activity around them. Keanu gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't need to thank me," he replied softly. "No one deserves to be treated like that." Despite the brief reprieve, Sandra couldn't shake the lingering unease. She knew the director's temper was unpredictable, and there was no guarantee he wouldn't lash out again once they resumed filming. Still, Keanu's presence offered some comfort. He had stepped in when no one else would, and that act of solidarity meant more than she could put into words. As they waited for the break to end, Sandra found herself replaying the moment in her mind. She wondered why Keanu had chosen to speak up. Was it because he genuinely believed in her talent? Or was it simply his nature to stand up for others, regardless of the circumstances? While Sandra wrestled with her thoughts, Keanu busied himself reviewing the scene. He pulled out his script and flipped through the pages, studying the dialogue and blocking. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like he was simply preparing for the next take. But Sandra noticed something else, a quiet determination in the way he focused. When he finally looked up, he gestured for her to join him. "Let's run lines together," he suggested, his tone casual but inviting. Sandra hesitated for a moment before nodding. Anything to keep her mind off the tension and the fear of what might come next. They moved to a quiet corner of the set, away from the prying eyes of the crew. Standing side by side, they began rehearsing the scene, their voices low but clear. At first, Sandra struggled to concentrate, her earlier nerves still lingering. But as they worked through the dialogue, something remarkable happened. Keanu's calm energy seemed to seep into her, steadying her shaky confidence. He listened, intently to every word she said, offering subtle suggestions without making her feel self-conscious. "Try pausing here," he advised gently, pointing to a line in the script. "It gives the emotion more room to breathe." His guidance wasn't just technical, it was emotional. Keanu understood the importance of creating a safe space for actors to explore their characters, especially during difficult scenes. He encouraged Sandra to trust her instincts, reminding her that vulnerability was a strength, not a weakness. Slowly but surely, she began to relax. The lines came more naturally and the emotions felt less forced. By the time they finished running through the scene, Sandra felt a newfound sense of readiness. She wasn't sure if it was enough to satisfy the director, but at least she felt prepared to give it her best shot. When the 5-minute break ended, the director returned, his expression unreadable. He barked orders to reset the set, his usual gruffness masking whatever thoughts were swirling in his head. As the crew scrambled to comply, Sandra took her place, feeling a strange mix of apprehension and resolve. Keanu stood nearby, giving her a quick nod of encouragement before taking his own position. The cameras rolled, and the scene began anew. This time something was different. Sandra delivered her lines with a depth and authenticity that hadn't been there before. Her earlier insecurity had given way to a quiet confidence, fueled by Keanu's support and her own rediscovered belief in herself. Even the director seemed to notice the change. He didn't interrupt or criticize. Instead, he watched silently, his arms crossed over his chest. When the scene concluded, there was a beat of silence before he finally spoke. "Good," he said gruffly, his tone lacking its usual bite. "Let's move on." The relief that washed over Sandra was almost overwhelming. She glanced at Keanu, who gave her another small smile before turning his attention to the next setup. Though the day was far from over, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could survive this role and emerge stronger for it. And, though she didn't say it aloud, she knew she owed a great deal of that strength to the man standing beside her. As the day wore on, the mood on set began to shift in subtle but noticeable ways. The earlier tension had eased, replaced by a quiet determination that seemed to ripple through the cast and crew. Sandra carried herself differently now, her shoulders squared and her movements more confident. Each time the director called for another take, she approached it with focus and clarity, no longer weighed down by the fear of failure. Keanu's intervention had done more than just diffuse a tense situation. It had reignited something within her, a belief in her own abilities that she hadn't realized had dimmed. Keanu, for his part, continued to play the role of both co-star and quiet supporter. He didn't draw attention to himself or make a big deal out of what he had done earlier. Instead, he stayed in the background, offering small gestures of encouragement when needed. During breaks between scenes, he would casually chat with Sandra, keeping the conversation light and positive. "You're killing it," he said at one point, leaning against a nearby table as they waited for the next setup. His words were simple, but they carried a sincerity that made them feel genuine. Sandra smiled faintly, appreciating the effort, even if she still felt unsure of herself. The director, meanwhile, seemed to have softened, at least slightly. While he was still demanding and quick to point out mistakes, his tone lacked the sharp edge it had earlier. Whether this change was due to Keanu's earlier confrontation or simply because the performances were improving, no one could say for sure. What mattered most was that the atmosphere felt less hostile, allowing everyone to focus on their work without constantly bracing for an outburst. For Sandra, this made all the difference. She found it easier to immerse herself in her character, letting go of the self-doubt that had plagued her earlier in the day. One particularly challenging scene came up later in the afternoon, a pivotal moment in the film where emotions ran high and the stakes were clear. It required Sandra to deliver a monologue filled with raw vulnerability, a task that would test any actor's skill. As the crew prepared the set, Sandra took a few moments to gather her thoughts. She closed her eyes, visualizing the scene and trying to channel the emotions her character was meant to feel. When she opened them again, she saw Keanu standing, nearby, watching her with a thoughtful expression. "You've got this," he said simply, his voice low enough that only she could hear. There was no doubt in his tone, no hint of hesitation. Sandra nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude wash over her. She knew she wasn't alone anymore, not with Keanu by her side. As they moved into position, she reminded herself of everything they had worked on together during their impromptu rehearsal earlier. The pauses, the emphasis, the subtle shifts in tone, they all came flooding back, grounding her in the moment. When the cameras rolled, Sandra poured every ounce of emotion into her performance. Her voice trembled at times, not from nerves, but from the weight of the words she spoke. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over naturally as the scene reached its climax. Around her, the crew watched in silence, captivated by the authenticity of her portrayal. Even the director, who rarely showed signs of approval until post-production, stood motionless, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. When the scene ended, there was a brief pause before he finally broke the silence. "That's a wrap," he said gruffly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The crew erupted into quiet applause, their cheers muffled but heartfelt. Sandra exhaled deeply, her body sagging with relief as the adrenaline began to fade. She turned to Keanu, who gave her a nod of acknowledgement. "See? Told you," he said with a faint smile, his usual calm demeanor masking whatever pride he might have felt. Sandra laughed softly, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for today," she admitted, her voice tinged with both humor and sincerity. Keanu shrugged, brushing off the comment as if it were nothing. "Just doing my job," he replied lightly. Later that evening, after filming wrapped for the day, Sandra found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. She sat in her trailer, sipping a cup of tea as the events of the day replayed in her mind. The director's harsh words, Keanu's unexpected intervention, the breakthrough during the emotional scene, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. She realized that while the director's behavior had been difficult to endure, it had also pushed her to dig deeper and find strength she didn't know she had. And Keanu's support had been the anchor that kept her grounded, reminding her that she wasn't alone in navigating the challenges of the industry. Her thoughts drifted to Keanu once again. He was unlike anyone she had ever worked with, so humble, so kind, yet fiercely protective when it mattered most. In Hollywood, where egos often clashed and competition ran rampant, his actions stood out as a rare act of humanity. Sandra couldn't help but wonder if she would have made it through the day without him. Probably, she thought, but it wouldn't have been the same. It wouldn't have ended with her feeling proud of what she had accomplished. As she packed up her things and prepared to leave the set, Sandra spotted Keanu heading toward his car. Without thinking, she called out to him, jogging a few steps to catch up. "Hey," she said, stopping beside him. Keanu turned, raising an eyebrow in curiosity. "Yeah?" he asked, his tone casual but warm. Sandra hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. "I just wanted to say thank you again," she said finally, her voice soft but sincere. "For everything. You didn't have to do what you did today, but you did. And it meant more to me than I can explain." Keanu looked at her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that lit up his entire face. "Like I said before," he replied gently, "we're a team. Nobody should have to face that kind of pressure alone." His words hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. Sandra nodded, feeling a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to say more, to express just how much his kindness had impacted her, but she knew words wouldn't do it justice. Instead, she offered him a grateful smile, which he returned before turning to walk away. As Sandra watched him drive, off into the night, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The day had been tough, no doubt about it, but it had also taught her something valuable. In an industry often defined by its cutthroat nature, acts of kindness could shine brighter than any spotlight. And sometimes, all it took was one person, stepping up to remind you of your worth. For Sandra, that person had been Keanu, and she knew she would never forget it. The next morning, Sandra arrived on set feeling lighter than she had in days. The previous evening's conversation with Keanu lingered in her mind, a comforting reminder that kindness still existed even in the most challenging environments. She carried a cup of coffee in one hand and her script in the other, her steps confident as she made her way to the craft services table. The crew greeted her warmly, their smiles genuine and encouraging. It was clear that yesterday's events had left an impression, not just on Sandra, but on everyone who had witnessed Keanu's quiet act of solidarity. As she flipped through her script, Sandra noticed something unusual. Someone had scribbled small notes in the margins, little reminders like, pause here or soften your tone. At first, she thought it might be her own handwriting from a late-night study session, but then she realized the handwriting wasn't hers. It was neat and precise, almost too perfect to belong to anyone else but Keanu. A smile spread across her face as she traced the words with her finger. He hadn't said anything about adding these notes, but knowing him, he probably wanted her to have them without making a fuss over it. That was just his way, always giving without expecting anything in return. The director arrived shortly after, his demeanor unchanged but noticeably less volatile than the day before. He barked a few orders, snapping his fingers at the lighting, teamed to adjust the overhead rig, but there was no trace of the explosive anger that had dominated the set earlier. Sandra took this as a good sign, though she remained cautious. She knew better than to let her guard down completely. The film industry was unpredictable, and even the smallest misstep could reignite tensions. Still, she couldn't deny the sense of relief that washed over her as filming resumed. Today's scenes were less emotionally taxing but required a different kind of precision. They involved intricate choreography between Sandra and Keanu, their characters navigating a delicate dance of trust and vulnerability. Each movement had to align perfectly with the camera angles, and timing was everything. Sandra focused intently, counting beats under her breath as they rehearsed. Keanu matched her energy effortlessly, his presence steady and reassuring. Together, they created a rhythm that felt natural, almost instinctive. Between takes, Keanu cracked jokes to lighten the mood, his dry humor earning laughter from the crew. If we mess this up again, maybe we should switch roles, he teased, pretending to flip through Sandra's lines. I hear I'd look great in your wardrobe. Sandra rolled her eyes, chuckling despite herself. In your dreams, she shot back, playfully swatting at his arm. Their banter brought a sense of ease to the set, dissolving any lingering awkwardness from the previous day. Even the director cracked a rare smile, though he quickly masked it by adjusting his headset. By midday, the scene was nearly complete. The director called for one final take, emphasizing the importance of nailing every detail. Sandra nodded, taking a deep breath as she prepared herself mentally. Keanu gave her a subtle thumbs up from across the room, mouthing the words, "You've got this." His unwavering support gave her the boost she needed. When the cameras rolled, she moved through the choreography with fluid grace, her performance seamless and natural. Every glance, every gesture told a story, drawing the audience into the world they were creating. When the scene wrapped, the director surprised everyone by offering actual praise. "Good work," he said gruffly, nodding at both Sandra and Keanu. It wasn't effusive or overly enthusiastic, but coming from him, it felt monumental. The crew erupted into applause once again, their cheers echoing through the soundstage. Sandra beamed, feeling a rush of pride wash over her. She glanced at Keanu, who grinned back, clearly pleased with how far they had come since the start of the project. During the lunch break, Sandra found herself sitting beside Keanu at a long folding table filled with sandwiches and salads. They ate in companionable silence for a while, watching as the crew bustled around them. Eventually, Sandra broke the quiet. "Do you ever get tired of being so nice?" she asked, half joking but genuinely curious. Keanu raised an eyebrow, amused by the question. "Nice?" he repeated, feigning offense. "Are you saying I'm boring?" Sandra laughed, shaking her head. "No, not boring, just, I don't know. You're always helping people. Always. Putting others first. Doesn't it ever wear you out?" Her tone was light, but there was sincerity behind her words. She admired Keanu's ability to stay grounded and compassionate in an industry that often celebrated ego over empathy. Keanu thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted, shrugging slightly. "But honestly, it's easier than the alternative. If I let negativity get to me, or worse, start treating people badly, it would eat away at me. I'd rather focus on what matters, doing good work and being decent to people along the way." His response was simple yet profound, reflecting the philosophy that guided his life both on and off screen. Sandra mulled over his words as they finished their meal. She realized that Keanu's approach wasn't just about avoiding conflict. It was about creating something positive, even in difficult situations. In Hollywood, where competition often overshadowed collaboration, his outlook was refreshing. It reminded her why she had fallen in love with acting in the first place, the opportunity to connect with others, to tell stories that resonated and inspired. As the afternoon stretched on, the momentum on set continued to build. Scenes flowed smoothly, and the cast and crew worked together with a newfound sense of unity. Sandra found herself thriving, her confidence growing with each passing hour. She no longer feared the director's critiques or doubted her abilities. Instead, she embraced the challenges, viewing them as opportunities to learn and grow. And whenever self-doubt crept in, she remembered Keanu's quiet reassurance and pushed forward. By the end of the day, exhaustion set in, but it was the kind that came from hard work and accomplishment. Sandra packed up her belongings, pausing to thank the crew members who had supported her throughout the shoot. As she walked toward the parking lot, she spotted Keanu leaning against his car, scrolling through his phone. "Hey," she called out, waving as she approached. He looked up, smiling when he saw her. "Hey yourself," he replied. "How's it going?" Sandra sighed contentedly, leaning against the hood of his car. "It's going well," she said, her voice tinged with gratitude. "Better than I expected, actually. Thanks to you." Keanu shook his head, dismissing the compliment as usual. "Don't mention it," he said lightly. "Besides, you did all the heavy lifting. I just helped keep the road clear." They stood there for a while, talking about everything and nothing, the weather, their favorite movies, the quirks of working on set. For a brief moment, the pressures of Hollywood faded away, replaced by the simplicity of human connection. Sandra realized that moments like these were rare and precious, especially in an industry that often prioritized appearances over authenticity. She vowed to hold on to them, to remember the value of kindness and camaraderie. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the studio lot, Sandra finally said goodbye to Keanu. "See you tomorrow," she said, waving as she headed to her car. He nodded, giving her a small wave in return. "Tomorrow," he echoed, his voice carrying a hint of warmth. Driving home, Sandra reflected on the day's events. She thought about the challenges she had faced, the lessons she had learned, and the friendships she had forged. Most of all, she thought about Keanu, his quiet strength, his unwavering support, and his belief in the power of kindness. In an industry known for its harsh realities, he was a reminder that humanity could still shine through. And for that, Sandra knew she would always be grateful. The following days on set felt like a turning point, not just for Sandra but for the entire production. The tension that had once loomed over everything seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose and teamwork. It wasn't as though the director suddenly transformed into a kinder version of himself. His standards remained high, and he still pushed everyone to their limits. But there was a subtle shift in how people responded to him. Instead of cowering under his sharp critiques, They began to meet them with resilience, knowing that they were all working toward the same goal. And at the center of it all was Keanu, whose quiet leadership continued to inspire those around him. Sandra noticed this change most acutely in herself. Each morning she arrived on set feeling more prepared and self-assured than the day before. She no longer second-guessed her instincts or feared making mistakes. If anything, she embraced them as part of the process, trusting that every misstep brought her closer to finding the truth of her character. Her growing confidence didn't go unnoticed. One afternoon, while reviewing footage from the previous week, the cinematographer pulled her aside. "You're really coming into your own," he said, his tone warm and encouraging. "It's like you've unlocked something." Sandra smiled, touched by the compliment. "I think I'm finally figuring out what works," she replied humbly. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about figuring things out. It was about having someone believe in her when she doubted herself. That belief had come from Keanu, and it had made all the difference. Keanu, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had changed. He remained focused on his role, delivering performances that were understated yet deeply compelling. Off camera, he continued to support Sandra in small but meaningful ways, offering advice during tricky scenes, sharing stories from his own experiences, or simply cracking jokes to keep spirits high. His presence was calming, a steady force amid the chaos of filmmaking. Yet despite his efforts to stay low-key, word of his kindness spread among the crew. People started referring to him as the glue holding everything together, though he would have laughed at the nickname if he'd heard it. As filming progressed, the cast and crew grew closer, forming bonds that went beyond professional courtesy. Lunch breaks became lively gatherings where laughter echoed through the studio lot. Conversations ranged from industry gossip to personal anecdotes, creating an atmosphere of camaraderie that hadn't existed at the start of the project. Sandra found herself opening up more, sharing bits of her life with her colleagues in a way she hadn't done before. She talked about her childhood dreams of becoming an actress, the struggles she faced early in her career, and the moments of doubt that sometimes crept in even now. To her surprise, others shared similar stories, revealing vulnerabilities they rarely discussed outside of close circles. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of shooting, the team decided to unwind with a casual dinner at a nearby restaurant. Sandra hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted to extend her workday any further, but Keanu encouraged her to join, insisting it would be good for morale. "Come on," he said, nudging her gently. "We deserve a break. Plus, I hear they have amazing pie here." Reluctantly, Sandra agreed, tagging along with the group. The dinner turned out to be exactly what everyone needed. Over plates of hearty food and glasses of cold drinks, the conversation flowed freely. Someone brought up funny bloopers from past shoots, prompting bursts of laughter that drew curious glances from neighboring tables. Another person proposed a toast to the hard work everyone had put in so far. "Here's to surviving the director and each other," they joked, raising their glasses. Sandra joined in, clinking hers against Keanu's with a grin. Later, as dessert arrived, Keanu leaned back in his chair, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. Sandra caught him smiling and raised an eyebrow. "What's so amusing?" she asked playfully. Keanu shrugged, gesturing to the room. "This," he said simply. "All of it. We spend so much time stressing about the little things, but moments like this remind us why we do what we do. It's not just about the movies, it's about the people." His words resonated deeply with Sandra. She glanced around the table, taking in the faces of her coworkers. The makeup artist who always remembered her coffee order, the sound technician who stayed late to fix equipment without complaint, the assistant director who juggled endless tasks with grace. These were the unsung heroes of the film, the ones who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make magic happen. For the first time, Sandra truly understood how interconnected they all were, each playing a vital role in bringing the story to life. Back on set the next day, the renewed sense of unity translated into smoother operations. Scenes that might have taken hours to perfect were completed in record time, thanks to improved communication and collaboration. Even the director seemed less irritable, perhaps sensing the positive energy radiating from the team. When he praised a particularly challenging sequence, calling it damn near perfect, the crew erupted into cheers, celebrating the milestone together. For Sandra, one of the most rewarding aspects of the experience was seeing how far she had come since the beginning of the project. There were still tough days, of course, moments when self-doubt crept in or exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. But she handled them differently now, drawing strength from the lessons she had learned along the way. She realized that success wasn't just about talent or luck. It was about perseverance, adaptability, and leaning on others when needed. 1. Afternoon. During a rare lull in filming, Sandra found herself sitting alone in a quiet corner of the set. She flipped through her script absently, reflecting on the journey she had undertaken. So much had changed, not just in her performance, but in her perspective. Acting had always been her passion, but now she saw it as more than just a craft. It was a way to connect with others, to tell stories that mattered, to create something lasting. Keanu appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up," he said, handing her one. Sandra accepted it gratefully, sipping the warm liquid as she looked up at him. "How do you do it?" she asked suddenly, surprising even herself. Keanu tilted his head, puzzled. "Do what?" "Stay so calm," Sandra clarified. "No matter what happens, you never seem rattled. Like you just handle things. How do you manage that?" Keanu chuckled softly, settling onto the chair next to hers. "Honestly, it's not about staying calm," he admitted. "I get stressed and frustrated like anyone else. But I've learned that panicking doesn't solve anything. What helps is focusing on what you can control and letting go of the rest. And remembering that we're all in this together." His answer stayed with Sandra long after their conversation ended. It was a simple philosophy, yet profoundly effective. As she returned to work, she tried to apply it to every challenge she encountered, whether it was mastering a difficult line or navigating a tense interaction with the director. Slowly but surely, she began to see results, not just in her performance, but in her overall mindset. By the final week of filming, the transformation was undeniable. Sandra moved through scenes with ease, her confidence evident in every gesture and expression. The director, who had once dismissed her as inexperienced, now regarded her with a mix of respect and admiration. "You've grown," he remarked one evening, his tone gruff but sincere. "Good job." Though brief, the acknowledgement meant the world to Sandra, validating all the hard work she had poured into the role. On the last day of shooting, the mood was bittersweet. Everyone gathered for a wrap party, exchanging hugs and heartfelt goodbyes. Sandra stood at the center of it all, overwhelmed by gratitude. She thought about the friendships she had formed, the obstacles she had overcome, and the person she had become. And as she looked across the room at Keanu, who raised his glass in a silent toast, she knew one thing for certain. None of it would have been possible without him. The final day of filming arrived, bringing with it a whirlwind of emotions. The set buzzed with a mix of excitement and nostalgia as the cast and crew prepared for the last few scenes. Boxes were packed, equipment was dismantled, and the once bustling studio began to feel emptier by the hour. For Sandra, the realization that this chapter of her life was ending hit her harder than she expected. She had grown so much over the course of the project, not just as an actress, but as a person. And saying goodbye felt like losing a part of herself. As they filmed the closing scenes, Sandra poured every ounce of emotion into her performance. This was her chance to leave everything on the screen, to give her character the farewell she deserved. Keanu matched her intensity, their chemistry stronger than ever after weeks of working together. Every glance, every line delivery carried the weight of their shared journey. When the director finally called cut for the very last time, there was a moment of stunned silence before the room erupted into applause. Tears welled up in Sandra's eyes as she hugged her co-stars and thanked the crew, her voice trembling with gratitude. After the cameras stopped rolling, The team gathered for one final group photo. Everyone crowded around, arms slung over shoulders, smiles wide and genuine. Sandra stood next to Keanu, leaning slightly against him as the photographer counted down. "Smile!" he shouted, capturing the moment forever. As the flash went off, Sandra felt a pang of sadness knowing that this was the end of something special. But at the same time, she felt a deep sense of pride for what they had created and for the bonds they had formed. Later that evening, the wrap party took place at a nearby venue, decorated with strings of fairy lights and posters from the film. Music played softly in the background as people mingled, laughing and reminiscing about their favorite moments on set. Sandra moved through the crowd, stopping to thank each person individually. She spoke to the makeup artist who had spent hours perfecting her look, the gaffer who always made sure the lighting was flawless, and the script supervisor who caught every tiny error. Each conversation filled her with warmth, reminding her how many people had contributed to making the film possible. At one point, Sandra found herself standing alone near the bar, sipping a glass of sparkling water. Her mind wandered back to the beginning of the project, the fear, the self-doubt, the harsh words from the director. It seemed like a lifetime ago now. She thought about how far she had come and how much she owed to the people around her. Most of all, she thought about Keanu. His quiet acts of kindness had changed not just her experience on set, but the way she viewed the industry as a whole. He had shown her that success wasn't just about talent or hard work. It was also about lifting others up along the way. Keanu approached her then, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you could use one last caffeine boost," he said with a grin, handing her a cup. Sandra laughed, taking it gratefully. "You always know exactly what I need," she replied, shaking her head in amazement. They stood side by side, watching as the party unfolded around them. The music grew louder, and someone started a round of karaoke, prompting cheers and laughter from the crowd. "You know," Sandra began after a while, her tone thoughtful, "I don't think I would have made it through this without you." Keanu glanced at her, his expression softening. "Of course you would have," he said firmly. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. I just nudged you a little when you needed it." Sandra shook her head, unconvinced. "It was more than a nudge," she insisted. "You stepped in when no one else did. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. That's not something I'll ever forget." Her voice wavered slightly, and she looked away, embarrassed by the surge of emotion rising within her. Keanu placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch light but reassuring. "We're supposed to support each other," he said simply. "That's what makes this job worthwhile, all the connections we build along the way. If I can help even one person feel less alone, then it's worth it." His words stayed with Sandra long after the party ended. As she drove home that night, she replayed their conversation in her mind, marveling at the simplicity of his philosophy. In a world that often celebrated individual achievement, Keanu reminded her of the power of community. He showed her that true success wasn't measured by accolades or box office numbers. It was measured by the impact you had on those around you. In the weeks that followed, Sandra returned to her normal routine, adjusting to life without the daily rhythm of filming. She missed the camaraderie of the set and the thrill of creating something new. But she also felt a renewed sense of purpose. The lessons she had learned during the project stayed with her, guiding her decisions and shaping her interactions with others. She resolved to pay forward the kindness Keanu had shown her, looking for opportunities to support and uplift those in need. When the film premiered months later, Sandra attended the red carpet event with mixed feelings. On one hand, she was proud of what they had accomplished, a heartfelt story brought to life through collaboration and perseverance. On the other hand, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness knowing that the experience was truly over. As she posed for photos and answered interview questions, her thoughts kept drifting back to Keanu, who stood a few feet away, chatting casually with reporters. During the screening, Sandra sat in the theater, clutching her hands tightly as the opening credits rolled. Watching the film unfold on the big screen was surreal, almost like seeing a different version of herself. She relived every scene, every emotion, every triumph and challenge. When the emotional climax of the story hit, She noticed several audience members wiping away tears. It was a reminder of why she loved acting, to connect with people, to tell stories that resonated deeply. After the movie ended, the cast and crew gathered backstage for a private celebration. The energy was electric, filled with hugs, laughter, and congratulations. Sandra sought out Keanu, finding him surrounded by well-wishers. She waited patiently until he noticed her, then pulled him aside. "I just wanted to say this one last time," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything. I wouldn't be here without you." Keanu smiled, pulling her into a quick hug. "Any time," he said softly. "And remember, you earned this. Every bit of it." Years later, when Sandra reflected on her career, she often thought about that pivotal project. It had been a turning point, both professionally and personally. She credited it with teaching her resilience, humility, and the importance of kindness. And whenever she faced challenges in the future, she reminded herself of Keanu's quiet strength and unwavering belief in humanity. Though their paths diverged after the film, Sandra and Keanu remained friends, occasionally crossing paths at industry events or catching up over coffee. Their bond was built on mutual respect and shared experiences, a testament to the lasting impact of compassion and solidarity. To Sandra, Keanu would always be more than just a co-star. He was a reminder of the goodness that existed in the world, even in the most unexpected places. And so, as Sandra continued her journey in Hollywood, she carried those lessons with her, letting them guide her choices and shape her legacy. Because in the end, it wasn't just about the films she made, it was about the lives she touched along the way.